Hey everyone, I am Magical Hacker, and this is episode number 6 of the Eminence Podcast, the non-CEDH Commander podcast where I help you in the command zone with your deck building skills, and I help you on the battlefield with your deck piloting skills. This podcast is brought to you by Orchestra of Anarchy and the rest of my patrons at patreon.com/magicalhacker. And today's topic, chosen by Orchestra of Anarchy, is when are controversial win cons appropriate? So what is a controversial win con? For me, in my mind, I think of any win con that you can expect or sometimes find that an opponent gets salty by it, right? That's what makes it controversial. If everybody thinks it's fine, then it's not controversial. And of course, no matter what win con you go for, you're one person that thinks it's okay because you're playing it. So you'll never find a win con where everybody in the whole world agrees that it's not okay. So there's always going to be at least one person. But sometimes there's also going to be somebody who thinks that it's not okay to play that win con. So let's talk about 3 situations that I think will cover up 90% of the times where a win con is controversial, when to play it and when not to play it. I think for this episode, I'm also going to be relying pretty heavily on information found at edhrec.com. They've got a really interesting thing that they do almost every year. And I think it has been every year actually since 2019, where they ask the community to vote on which cards they find are the saltiest. So looking at some of those, we can actually take a look at them and consider those to be controversial win cons in many situations. I'm sure there are going to be cards that are not at the top of this list that are also going to be controversial win cons. Those might not come up quite so often. I will tell one story here before we get started about a time where I played a win con that was kind of controversial. So a long time ago, I had a Abzan Reanimator deck. Abzan here referring to the color combination white plus black plus green. And my commander was Teneb the Harvester. This is a 6-mana, 6/6 flying dragon, legendary creature. Costs 3 generic, 1 white, 1 black, 1 green. And then it has this ability, when it deals combat damage to a player, you can pay 2 generic and 1 black. If you do, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. So that was Teneb the Harvester. And I wanted to build kind of a janky Timmy style Reanimator deck. So I looked for what are some really cool big creatures I can cheat into play with an ability like that. Right, I'm playing things that mill myself. I'm playing a couple of things that will discard cards from my own hand. And some of the cards that I really wanted to play are some of the Praetors. So I played Sheoldred. Of course, these are talking about the old Praetors. Sheoldred. I had Elesh Norn. I had Vorinclex. And so those were 3 of the cards that I really like to play in the deck. And I figured, I'm not really going to have a spot to play Praetors in general. Because, well, first of all, if I want to include them, it's probably because they have an ability or a set of abilities that really synergize well with my deck. Well, not in this case. The case here, since I'm playing multiples, has to do with the fact, well, they're big creatures. They're pretty powerful. I don't need to build around them to take advantage of them. So let's just go ahead and use those as some of the things that I can reanimate. Now, let me make something really clear here. This deck was not very over the top powerful, right? Because there was a lot of setup. First, I had to cast my commander. Then I had to put stuff into the graveyard. Then I had to deal combat damage with my commander. Then I had to bring it back out from the graveyard. Then I had to then use it. So there's a lot of steps here. And of course, I had some other things that could reanimate besides my commander, of course. But it wasn't that it wasn't a very oppressive deck where I just took control of the game very early on. People couldn't do things and the game was over before they could really get started. That was not the case here at all. This was just a slow deck, just eventually getting to the point where I could reanimate something that could be pretty impactful. And if it went away, no problem. I have more reanimation. I can get it back again. So that was kind of the deck idea. And I was playing against a guy who, even now, I look back and I think he was a nice guy. I don't think he was a very selfish player or a very immature player, which, there are times where you're going to come into players like that. I don't think that was the case here. But I remember playing this deck, and he got very upset that I was playing Praetors. And he said that he just didn't want to be playing against somebody who had Praetors in their deck. Having one was one thing, but having all 3 was a totally different story. And in that situation, I actually did reanimate, I think 1 or 2 of them, and I had all 3 of them at some point in the graveyard. And he just got very upset. And everybody that I was playing with was kind of neutral. Nobody was like, hey man, it's okay for him to play Praetors. It's not a problem. But then there was nobody that was like, yeah, it's not right for you to play Praetors. Everybody was like, it's okay. You don't have to. It's not, you're not a problem for playing them. And then he's not a problem for complaining about them. Both of you guys have a legitimate, perspective that I think is important. So there was a very balanced reaction from the other players there at the table. But I remember thinking back and I thought, wow, this was an example where I played a win con that was controversial, and the way that I could have proactively avoided a situation like that, something confrontational, is for a much better Rule 0 where when we had talked about what things we didn't want to play in the game, this player could have said ahead of time, I don't want to play a game where all the Praetors are potentially able to enter the battlefield. I find that they're very strong cards that, especially in multiples, the game just becomes such a slog. So if we had a game discussion at the beginning where he opened up with that, not only would I have been able to use a different deck and avoid that whole situation altogether, but it would also open up a conversation where other people could have felt more comfortable saying, oh, I agree that I don't want to be playing a game with multiple Praetors. So I felt like that kind of hindered things as well. So that's why I think it's important to talk about why there are times where a win con might not be appropriate. It might be a controversial win con, and it might not be the right time to play it. And if you're interested in more discussion about what Rule 0 should mean, my last episode number 5, talked about that. Definitely take a look. You can take a look on Spotify, just search up Magical Hacker, or on YouTube, again, just search Magical Hacker, and you'll find my channel that way too. Okay, so let's start off by talking about the top 4 most salty cards in Commander, according to EDH Rec and then the surveys that they have done. The top 4 here, and they have a salt score. I'll talk about what that salt score is in relationship to each other, but I don't know what it means in general. So hopefully that makes sense. But we got the first card here is Stasis. It's the saltiest card in Commander at this time, and it has a salt score of 2.92. So think of the 2.92 as being kind of the ceiling, right? Winter Orb is pretty much right there too. It's at 2.91. Static Orb is a pretty big jump down at 2.71, and then Vorinclex even further down at 2.60. All 4 of these cards, though, are similar in one way. They're all preventing opponents from untapping. So I'm not going to read out each one of these cards. There's a lot of things to read, but I do want to just read the relevant piece of text from each card. Stasis says, players skip their untap steps. Winter Orb says, players can't untap more than 1 land during their untap steps, specifically only as long as Winter Orb is untapped. So you can tap it down to actually get around that yourself. Static Orb, same thing. If Static Orb is untapped, players can't untap more than 2 permanents during their untap step. Vorinclex says whenever an opponent taps a land for mana, that land doesn't untap during that controller's next untap step. So all 4 of these cards kind of find themselves in the same category of cards that prevent your opponents from using any lands, right? It could be basic lands, non-basic lands, does not matter. You're not able to use those the way that your deck wants to be able to use them. This is what I would call stacks. Some people make a differentiation between hard stacks and soft stacks. Personally, I feel like trying to go in and specifically call one type of card one thing and another card another thing, if they have the same name of stacks, it's going to be really confusing. In fact, I would not even be surprised to find out that stacks is the least definitive of all names of something in Commander or in Magic, where you talk to 100 people, you'll get 20 different definitions of what stacks is. So I think for that reason, stacks is very hard to use in terms of a discussion. So maybe the better term for these cards is anti-land cards. Things that don't let you use mana from your lands the way you'd like to. There's a reason why these are so high up on that list. In fact, there's some other cards that we could talk about: Armageddon, Ravages of War, Obliterate, Devastation, Yokel Hops. These are cards where you can get rid of all the lands, and so people don't have lands at all. You destroy all lands. Mass land destruction is the term that's used for those. Messing with abilities of your opponents to produce mana from their lands, even their basic lands, I think that's a very special type of card. Once you start messing with basic lands, you're really treading some very difficult waters, because that's what people are relying on. Basic lands are a huge part of the game. That's right there in the name. They're basic to the game. And so messing with those kind of feels a bit controversial. I mentioned this in a previous episode. Personally, I don't mind if people play Mass Land Destruction. It doesn't bother me. It doesn't bother me at all compared to people conceding. I did talk about that in a previous episode. You can find more details about it there. But there are things that bother me. Mass Land Destruction, it isn't one of them. But I would say Mass Land Destruction as a win con is not appropriate when your play group says, hey, we don't want Mass Land Destruction in our games. You can definitely talk to them. I don't think there's anything preventing you from having a discussion. You can say, well, I know people are not interested in Mass Land Destruction. Let's talk about why and see if we can come to some kind of middle ground, right? We can find a compromise. I think that's a great idea. But unless there is a compromise that's found, it's very disrespectful, I think, to other players who want to avoid a specific type of game pattern and then explicitly ask to play only against players that don't have those types of play patterns in their deck. I think it's very disrespectful to then listen to them, go, okay, and then still do it anyways. I think that's pretty rude, is what I would say. So the first situation where I think controversial win cons are not appropriate is when the play group that you're playing with has said, hey, this is not something that we want part of our game, then you do it even though that's something that they don't want. And I think a better way to handle it is to have a discussion. Try to find middle ground if you can. If you can't find middle ground, that's okay. You can always wait to play those decks with other players who are okay with Mass Land Destruction. I promise you, we do exist. We are out there. So you will, find them if you're looking for players who are okay with Mass Land Destruction or hard stacks, whatever you want to call it, anti-land cards. So they definitely exist. Number 5 on the list, though, and I know I kind of skipped around here. Number 6, number 8, number 9, number 10, number 11 are those cards I mentioned. Armageddon, Yokel Hops, Obliterate, Devastation, and Ravages of War specifically. They're all in between roughly 2.5 and 2.3. So they're all kind of in a similar spot here. But at 2.52, we have the next card I want to talk about, which is Expropriate. This is a pretty common card that comes up from time to time. It's because it's got two abilities, both of which are pretty, I should say, they're pretty effective at closing out a game. But then you make your opponent choose between an ability that will hurt all the players equally, or an ability that will hurt that player specifically a whole lot. So they've got to pick between, do you get an extra turn, or do you get one of their cards, their permanents on the battlefield? So you get one of their permanents, that hurts them a lot, whereas you getting an extra turn, it hurts everybody, but doesn't specifically hurt them in a much higher amount. So if each opponent is acting selfishly, they don't want to be hurt specifically the most, then you get 3 extra turns in addition to whatever you choose for yourself, which will probably be an extra turn. Essentially, you'll be able to cast this 9-drop and get 4 extra turns, which is very, very powerful. What would be a lot weaker is if each opponent instead chose that they allowed you to pick one of their permanents to gain control of. But for each opponent, that feels a lot worse, even though overall it's certainly a lot better, right? Instead of you getting 4 extra turns, instead you get 1 extra turn and then basically a blatant thievery effect, which is still powerful, still very powerful, but it's just very rare that it ever happens that way. So almost all the time, Expropriate gives you at least 2 turns and sometimes a permanent or 2 from some players who, especially if players feel like, I don't have anything that's important, you can have anything that I have. And that's how Expropriate usually works. When is it not appropriate to play Expropriate? I think this falls into the same category that we previously mentioned, although I would say it goes maybe a step further. With Expropriate, you might find yourself in a situation where when you play the Expropriate, it's easy for you to convince your opponents to make the wrong decision. And so I guess I leave that really up to you, the listener. Is it better to play a controversial win con and then try to help your opponents realize, hey, the smart thing to do is actually this, don't fall for the trap? Or is it better to try to play it sneaky and say, oh, what should you do? And try to lead them down the path of making the choice that ultimately will hurt them the most. So that's expropriate, which I don't think that fits into a second category outside of the have a Rule Zero conversation category. But it's certainly an important card to talk about here for this topic. Number 7 is Thassa's Oracle. And I think this is where we find ourselves in the second category of cards we have to find ourselves when it's appropriate to play a controversial win con. So when we got Thassa's Oracle, let me read this one off, by the way, because I think this one actually is important for me to read off the entire card. So Thassa's Oracle costs blue. It's a 1/3 Merfolk Wizard, and it says, when Thassa's Oracle enters the battlefield, look at the top X cards of your library, where X is your devotion to blue. Put up to one of them on top of your library, and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. If X is greater than or equal to the number of cards in your library, you win the game. So Thassa's Oracle, when it comes down, if you have no other permanents, you have at least a devotion to blue of 2, right? So if you have 1 or 2 cards or 0 cards in your library, you immediately win the game. This is combined a lot with cards like Demonic Consultation, and I'm sure there's other cards too. Any card that can cause you to have 0 cards in your library, Thassa's Oracle can combine with that, can combo with it in order to let you win the game. Importantly, Demonic Consultation is a 1 mana card. Let me read off that card too, because again, I think that's an important card to read off. If we're going to be talking about this combo, I think it's important for us to actually read off the combo and use that as part of our discussion. So Demonic Consultation, unfortunately, I have only access to an older Oracle text, so it's going to sound a little funky. Actually, hold on a second. You know what I can do? I can actually open up the newest one, because I feel like it's important for us to read it off. All right. Demonic Consultation costs black. It's an instant. It says this: choose a card name, exile the top 6 cards of your library, then reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a card with the chosen name. Put that card into your hand and exile all other cards revealed this way. So when you play Demonic Consultation, you can choose a card name that's not in your deck, right? So let's say I'm playing this card. Let's see, what's a great example of a card I definitely am not playing in Commander. Let's say I say Razorverge Thicket. That's probably a good card, but that's the only card I can think of off the top of my head. So let's say I play this card and then I play Razorverge Thicket. I'm not even playing the right colors to be playing Razorverge Thicket. Or you know what, even better example, Poliano the High City. It's a land that doesn't do anything in Commander. So let's say I play this card, I choose Poliano the High City as the card. I exile the top 6 cards of my library. Then I reveal my whole deck. No Poliano, right? All those cards get exiled, and that's it. I have no cards in hand, or no cards in my library. Then, for 2 blue mana, play the Thassa's Oracle and win the game. So I think there's something to be said here. It does kind of fit into the Rule Zero talk that we were mentioning before, but there's a separate layer here. This combo specifically is very, very good. In fact, it's so good, it's something that you could play in a lot of different decks in CEDH. There are a couple of combos that work super, super well. Another example is Notion Thief plus a wheel. That's something that's very good in CEDH and is the heart of the win con that you can find there. You've also got Dramatic Reversal plus Isochron Scepter. That's another big CEDH popular and common win condition. You've got the combo of any elf that can tap for a bunch of mana plus either Staff of Domination or Umbral Mantle, stuff like that, where you're using something that produces a lot of mana plus something that untaps itself just by paying mana. So you've got all these cards that they're very, very good. So good, in fact, that you can play them in CEDH. If you're sitting down to a table and you're asking, hey, let's play a non-CEDH game, I think that's a very important time where you have to realize the combos and the win cons that are good enough for CEDH, they're not good enough for non-CEDH. Not that they're bad, but that they're not appropriate. That those are not cards and combos that should be a part of non-CEDH decks. So, in other words, you have an opportunity to play those combos in CEDH, and in order to make other combos also able to be played at least somewhere, reserving the CEDH combos only for CEDH allows that to be the case. Allows the combos that are not good enough for CEDH to then have a time to shine as well. So I think that's the second time that that controversial win cons are not appropriate, which is, number one, first category, when Rule Zero talks and discussions that happen during Rule Zero allows people to be aware of the fact that certain cards are not okay and everybody agrees on that. That's the first category. Second category, when everybody's agreeing to not play a CEDH game, then the CEDH combos and win cons are things that should be reserved instead for CEDH. And then the last one here has to do with win cons that I think fall into a similar, but you'll see in a second here how it does have some separate applications for how it can be a little different. So continuing down, the next thing that we have here is Tergrid, God of Fright. And I'm not sure at what level this is, but it does find itself into a pretty similar one. And I would honestly put that in combination with Narset, Parter of Veils. So Tergrid, God of Fright is a card that is possible as a commander because it's a 5-drop legendary creature. It's mono black. And essentially, anytime you discard or sacrifice a permanent, whoever controls the Tergrid gets to put that card onto the battlefield for free. And that happens every time. So if they say they play a card that makes each opponent discard one card, if each opponent discards a permanent, they get all 3 of those permanents onto the battlefield. It doesn't matter if they're lands, doesn't matter if they're super expensive creatures or enchantments or planeswalkers or whatever. It doesn't matter. They'll go onto the battlefield for free. So when it comes to this, I think that you have to recognize anytime you have a commander that's super, super powerful, people are going to be able to see it from turn 0. So is Tergrid, God of Fright a controversial win con? I personally think it probably fits into that category. It's certainly a pretty salty card. People did put it on the top salty card list. So when I'm thinking about Tergrid, God of Fright, I think it's not really appropriate to play when you don't want to be targeted, right? If you don't want to be killed super quickly, you probably don't want to be playing those. Another great example here is Infect. The highest saltiness card in terms of Infect is Blightsteel Colossus. It's a 11/11 trample indestructible Infect creature. I believe it costs 12 mana. It's an artifact creature. It's probably on this list because people cheat it into play, and then if you can't block it or get rid of it, you gotta stay blocking it with creatures with lots of toughness in order to survive a couple of turns. So in a lot of ways, it is kind of like a one-shot kill from Blightsteel Colossus. And Infect, I think, does fall into a similar category as Tergrid. So, and Narset, Parter of Veils, I did mention that earlier. I was thinking about something else, but Narset, I would say, probably falls into the same category as the category 2. We did talk about Notion Thief plus Wheels. Of course, Narset plus Wheels is basically the same thing, so that fits there as well. All right, so with Infect, Tergrid, and other effects like that, when you're playing a deck, especially when you're playing a commander, where your opponents are going to be able to see it right away, and they're going to be afraid of it right away, it's not appropriate to play that win con when you don't want to be targeted. Meaning, if you're a player that doesn't want to be targeted by each of the 3 players, you don't want them to be attacking only you, countering only your spells, dealing damage only to your things. If that's not something that you like, you've got to, you've got to avoid telegraphing a controversial win con. That could be by choosing a commander that's very strong. When it comes to Infect, that could be playing a 1-mana Infect creature and then just trying to hit people for 1 Infect over and over and over, right? People, I might be afraid of a pump spell. Even if you do pump a spell and kill 1 player, you still have 2 other players to deal with. So anytime you have something like this, controversial win cons, I think you need to be playing them in a way that's smart. Not only do you have to be playing them in a way that's kind, you listen to your opponents for Rule 0, make sure that everybody's on the same page, you agree on what is in bounds and what is out of bounds, but you've also got to figure out a way, how do I play this really threatening, scary thing in a way that's not going to be super scary, threatening to my opponent, which would cause me to die super quickly. And I think that's an important element to keep track of. So, for example, when it comes to Infect, I've got a Jund Infect deck at the moment where I'm not using those 1 or 2 mana Infect creatures. Instead, I'm using 5 or 6 mana Infect creatures because those are the Infect creatures that tend to be a little bit bigger. So I can play those down, and if I've already got a Haste Enabler, I can attack with them right away. And if I've got a Damage Doubler, I can make them lethal at the same time. So it turns that Infect strategy from being a high risk, high reward into a low risk, but, still somewhat high reward, although maybe not as high as turn 1, give it haste, pump it up to oblivion, and then you're dead. That might not be the case here in turn 1, 2, or 3 with my deck. But that's fine. I'm okay. Those controversial win cons, I'm playing them smart. And by doing so, even if I do happen to defeat an entire table with Infect, it isn't on turn 5 or turn 6. It is on turn 14 or 15 or maybe 12 or 13, whatever. And so, as a result, my opponents usually are not salty. They're not like, oh my gosh, Infect is horrible. They don't usually respond that way. They usually respond with, hey, that's a deck that's still within the realm of fair. And so I think it's appropriate to try to be kind with your win cons, listening to your opponents during the Rule Zero conversation. If you agree, go ahead and go forward without breaking the spirit of whatever is decided during Rule Zero. If you don't agree, either try to find a compromise with them. Literally just talk to them. Just talk to your opponents. Try to find a compromise if you don't agree with the Rule Zero discussion. Or if you can't find a compromise, but you really do want to play whatever they're against, then find a different group of players to play with. I think Magic Online makes it so easy to find any group of players that you're looking for. Some players are more respectful than others. That's true. But I think it's still something that you can find no matter what you're looking for. Eventually you will find the play group that you will have a lot of fun with. So I think that's pretty much it in terms of my opinion on this topic. Tell me what you think. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you agree with me, or do you feel like I'm missing something totally obvious? I'd love to hear your thoughts in a comment at youtube.com/magicalhackermtg or twitter.com/magical__hacker. If you want to pick the topic for an episode of the Eminence podcast, check out patreon.com/magicalhacker. Thank you again to Orchestra of Anarchy. Thank you to all of my patrons, and thank you for listening. Stay awesome, everybody.